Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Leverage Your Podcast show. If you're the first time joining, welcome. I'm Lindsay Phillips, your host, and I'm joined today with Alice Draper. She was actually a part of my podcast guesting Unsummit recently, and she absolutely wowed the audience sharing tips on how to pitch to be on a podcast. And her approach was just different for me. So I'm like, Alice, you so need to be on my show. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And also thank you for hosting such an incredible event. I haven't seen an event pulled off like just, I don't know, that event was very unique. And if
Oh,
anyone
thank
missed
you.
it, I hope that you come to any future events Lindsay might be hosting because yeah, I took a lot of value out of it and I just think it
Oh,
was
good.
so great. So happy to
Yeah.
be here.
Nerve-wracking, but fun. It was so good. So much value. And that's what we're going to deliver here today. So I like how you look at pitching to be on a show a little bit more holistically. So bear with us here, friend and audience. We will get to the pitching nitty gritty, but I think it's really important to think about what happens before you start pitching to be on this show. And I know for you, part of it is like identifying your position. What does that mean and how does it impact?
Yeah. Okay. So identify your position means a couple of things. The first is who is your audience? And it sounds really obvious, but it's a step that I've seen skip and it can be a little bit disastrous. So your audience are the people you want to get in front of, and you should have a reason probably why you want to get in front of that audience. Maybe they're your ideal readers for the book you're trying to promote. Maybe they are your ideal customers and you're trying to increase your brand awareness for your business. So that's your first step. And then your second step when you're thinking of identifying your position is where do you fit within that audience? So one of the things that I like to do and I like to encourage people to do is take people who have a lot of authority in your space. So, like, maybe your audience are entrepreneurs, growing online entrepreneurs. And you think of someone like Amy Porterfield, who has a lot of authority in that space. I like to like go and kind of look at all those people and see what they're delivering. And
Mm,
then you want to start thinking about, okay, how do I differentiate? So that would be, I'm assuming you know what you do. So are you an online business coach? You want to go find who are the other top online business coaches in my space speaking to my same audience. Or, maybe you run a social media marketing agency. Okay, who are some very well-known social media marketing agencies? Who are the founders? And are they a few steps ahead of me? That's also something I like to think of as like
yeah.
the ones who have that like 20, 30,000 followers if you only have 2,000 followers, not 500,000 followers, because you're probably not going to be able to like follow their PR trail just yet. So you would
Good
want to
point.
think like stepping stones. I want them to be ahead of me, but I don't want them to be like the biggest ones yet. And then go do a ton of market research and see what they're talking about and figure out where you could fill a gap in the market. So,
Mm,
if everyone is sharing how to leverage AI to, make posting online on social media faster, you could be like, okay, that's kind of been filled, and these people with more followers than me are all talking about it. What can I offer that no one is talking about? And start sort of trying to identify those gaps. And I'll stop there. But those are like the things I would think about
yeah.
when identifying your position, your audience, who's a little bit ahead of you, and then what gaps there are and where you could fill those gaps.
That's such an important point. And honestly, I wish I had to learn that early on because legit, I was a business was content marketing at the time. And I hired a booking agency. And my topic was like, I don't know, how to grow your business with content marketing. It was like how boring and vague. It was like same as everybody else. And and I didn't get booked. I had to like revamp or whatever. But that's a valid point. You really need to look at what's out there right now. And it's funny because there's that, I imagine there's that fine line of, you know, following a trend and say, oh, everyone wants to know about that. I should too. But I like where you're like, like try to be a little bit different, and what kind of angle can you go for to position yourself that way?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have a background in journalism, so luckily I'm
Mm,
trained in developing angles. But something I will say is that because when you think about this, it can be easy to get overwhelmed and think, there's nothing that I can talk about that no one else has spoken about yet.
hmm.
So, for example, if I want to go on podcasts and talk about how to get booked on podcasts, I'd be like, okay, but there are much bigger PR agencies who can also talk about this, so why would they choose me? And the one thing that we always have on our side is our personal story. So I haven't
Yes.
sent a pitch in a very long time on how to get booked on podcasts. But when I was sharing my personal story of how I got rejected from a ton of publications when I first learned to pitch. And then that process of like setting a rejection goal helped me to refine the craft of pitch. Then in my speaking points, I mentioned like I'll talk about how to pitch. And I got booked on a ton of podcasts talking about how to pitch. But the thing that got me there was my story, and that's something that is unique to me. So even though some of the action steps other people can
Hmm.
teach, obviously I have my own way, but there's lots of great people out there who have also great ways to teach it. They, yes, that has been done before, but my story hasn't been done, and people connect to both. They connect to the story and they
Yeah.
connect to the action points.
And I think a lot of people miss that. And I noticed when we had the VIP guest accelerator and you were giving feedback, I loved your feedback because again, it wasn't something that I had heard before, where you really touched upon the story and how to weave that into your pitch. And I think a lot of people are more like that nitty gritty. I can share this tip, that tip, and they miss that whole story piece. So let's dive into that for a little bit. Like, how do you think about your story and how do you use it for a pitch? It's hard for me to imagine it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, great question. How do you think of your story and how do you use it for a pitch? So, before I get into that, to backstep a bit, I think the action steps are really important, and the action steps
Okay.
come into every pitch we send out because people are going to be like, what are my listeners going to learn? Like, I want my listeners to walk away with something. So those always come into every pitch. But the action steps are very hard to differentiate. It's very hard for you to say, especially if you're in a highly saturated field, like a leadership coach or any
Mm,
coach, a business coach. It's very hard for you to pitch your steps on how to grow your business, grow your revenue, and stand out. But so that's why we bring in the story first. And the
yeah.
story, the goal of the story is the emotional hook. That's where the person emotionally connects to you enough to keep reading. And then they're like, okay, and now my listeners will learn all these things. Um, so yeah, so when you think about it, I like to think of, what would emotionally draw someone in. And it's often a little bit of vulnerability from your side. And that doesn't mean you have to talk about like your big T trauma about the time that you, I don't know, almost died from an eating disorder or whatever it is. You
Right.
can talk about that if that's really important to your work. If you, for example, run an eating disorder recovery
Hmm.
consultancy, that's a very important story. That would be a great emotional hook that ties to your work. But if you run a content marketing agency and that's a part of your life you haven't really shared, you could share something vulnerable that's smaller or a pain point that people would really relate to. Or, one that I use as an example is a pitch that I was sending as I opened it up with a story about how Adam Grant rejected me and how I celebrated this because he personally wrote to me like an email and, had clearly checked out my work. And then I like mentioned champagne rejections, and then I want to come on the podcast to talk about my work in rejection, and like rejection therapy. So that's not like me opening up like the
Yeah,
scariest
exactly.
thing. But it captures someone's intrigue. They relate to it. I'm talking about a rejection. I celebrated a rejection. It's a novel idea. I kind of want to keep reading. It's specific. I've name dropped. So they're like, oh, I know who that person is.
Yes.
A lot of the people. So it kind of touches on a lot of things. So I'd say like the story is probably your make and break, especially if you're not very
Mm.
famous and you don't have a lot of connections. So I really would spend a lot of time brainstorming it and think about emotion. Think about, does this hook someone? And it doesn't have to, it could be that it shocked them. It could be that they relate to you because they also have ADHD and this is an ADHD pitch and you opened up with the ADHD, there's a lot of different things that could be the
Yeah.
thing that hooks them in. But I would play with that, brainstorm, and I would test it. I would test it on people.
Ooh.
Does it grab them the minute I say the first 5 words? Do they want to know more? And you can tell, like, people's eyes will perk up. They'll be like, what?
Yes.
Or they're like, okay, cool. Moving on.
I'm sure you can tell when it falls flat. It doesn't. But yeah, I love that. Okay, so identifying your position, figuring out your story. Um, I think a lot of people get this wrong part to this too is like getting on the right podcast. I feel like when people start out with podcast guesting, they're just happy to be invited and they say yes to every podcast. What would you say is the criteria for researching or looking for the right podcast?
Yeah, good question. I'd say that getting on the wrong podcast isn't the end of the world if you have a lot of time in your hands, and it can be great practice for speaking. But if you want to be strategic, if you are paying someone to book you on podcasts, then you definitely want to make sure you're getting on the right podcasts, so that it's worth everyone's time and investment. So, in terms of criteria, I would say it goes back to like narrowing down who your audience is. So, if you're trying to sell a book and your audience are women in midlife, because it's a kind of midlife memoir of your transition, or, and you want to get in front of women who are 40, 50 plus years old, then I would take a look at the podcast. There's a ton of midlife podcasts out there. There are a ton of like, if it's a podcast that's generally geared towards women, you want to sort of take a look at the types of guests. And if the guests
Mm,
tend to be above 40, you can assume that the listeners are also probably around that age
right.
group. If the guests or, if the host herself is like 20 years old and she's interviewing people who are also in their 20s, you can assume you probably have a younger audience, or it might not land. So, yeah, a couple of things like you can sometimes tell by the title, you can tell by the types of guests. So, one of my clients, for example, serves women leaders, like women in corporate. And so, what we look at is if it's a male hosted podcast, we look at the frequency of female guests. If they have like every second or third guest is a female, we would pitch it because we assume there's a female listenership. But if in the last 10 episodes there hasn't been a single female
Mm,
guest, we can assume that it's a very heavily male-centric listenership. And so there's probably not a lot of her ideal clients in that audience. And so it's just not worth her time to go on that podcast. So yeah, so I think like a bunch of things is kind of
yeah.
holistically looking at titles, the name of the episode, the name of the show, who the host is. If it's a certain type of host, they probably have people similar to them listening to it as well.
I know it pays to do that legwork. It's funny. I always think I used to work in the real estate investing space or whatever. Um, and they were always like, okay, I need to get on real estate investing podcasts. And and I was like, do you though? Like, I feel like everyone else is in those podcasts. Like that's too obvious. Am I in the right like train of thought, or would it be beneficial to go in those kinds of podcasts if you are in that industry as an example?
Yeah, so I think you bring up a good point. I think it can be helpful to go into your industry specific podcast, but it can be very limited if you are in a very niche industry. So then that's to your point where we start looking at like complementary industries. So like if I take my own business model, for example, someone who's a book coach and helps people promote books might invite me on their podcast to talk about getting booked on podcasts. They're in a totally different space. They do provide different
Yeah.
service to me, but it's so complementary because their ideal clients are also my ideal clients. I work with people who often are publishing books.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think it's looking at complementary audiences as well, where like maybe real you can work and you can go in the same industry. And I like do think that, a lot of people collaborate with people who do the same thing as them. And I've collaborated with a lot of people who do same services as mine, and it's like been really, really beneficial to both of us.
Hmm.
But then I also think like, okay, there's a wider net, and you might run out of places to go
Yeah.
if you're staying in that very narrow net. And so what's the wider net? And yeah, complementary
Yeah.
services come in there, or complementary businesses.
100%. Okay, so we've looked at our position, our story, finding the right shows. Everyone always asks, what makes a good pitch? Because we all know what makes a bad pitch because we get them all the time. Um, so let's start thinking about like what are the hosts looking for?
Yeah. Okay, good question. I know you said we all know what makes a bad pitch, but just in case anyone doesn't, a bad pitch is a long list about who you are. Like, my name is, and I did blah, 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 and I won blah, 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 and I went to this thing, and it ends up being a resume. I'm learning about what university you studied at. At
Oh,
this point, no one's reading any of this. So, in terms of what makes a good pitch, Lindsay, what I found really interesting about your Unsummit was that at the VIP section session, there were, I think it was Spencer, also runs a podcast guest booking agency. And it was really interesting learning how different people appreciate different things in a pitch.
hmm.
And so I learned a lot, and I've noticed it that like I can respond to some pitches that are very different to the way I pitch, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like it was literally 2 lines, but what those 2 lines were really good, and it made me click into your links and learn more about you and want to have you on my show. So I want to preface this by saying there are different ways to
Yeah,
pitch. But I think a general consensus is sending a huge chunk of text that's your bio is not a good way to pitch.
agreed.
So my way of pitching, and that has worked for us for like the last over 5 years that we've been pitching podcasts, is to open with a very short but shocking story. And it's very specific. It usually puts you in the scene. So an example I often give is one of my clients' pitches that we did. It was a scene where I think it opened with like my boss walked in the room and said, "You're fired," and like threw something down, and then it was like, you know, this was an instance of where then we sort of contextualized like how often workplace harassment happens or whatever it was.
Mm,
But it was literally like you're in the scene, and then
yeah,
there's like some data, and now the reader is kind of like invested. They're like, what happened next? And then we introduce the clients, like, we often ghost pitch. So it was like, my name is so and so, and I run this thing, this business. And then we put the speaking points. And I have a template, so you don't need to remember all of this. I'm kind of walking you through my structure. It's that my templates, you can grab the full breakdown. It's hustlingwriters.com/templates. But yeah, so then you want that story that really sort of grabs the listener. And then you want speaking points, and the speaking points should be as actionable and specific as possible. So, where I th think a lot of people go wrong with speaking points is that they will go very broad, where let's say you are a mindset coach, you are now pitching how to like overcome negative beliefs and how to rewire your thinking. When you're going that broad, you're not really standing out because so many other
hmm,
people in that kind of mindset space, not necessarily even mindset coaches, just like they're in so many different related spaces that relate to mindsets are pitching very, very similar things. And so you're not really standing out. So what I often urge people to do is take one of their speaking points, run it through the AI and say, like, develop more speaking points with very unique language here.
hmm.
And so you're taking one idea and turning it into multiple sub ideas. And that's like also what we do with article writing, because with articles, like
Right,
often when we start writing, we want to pitch really broad ideas that never get accepted. We need to get like
right.
down, 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 get as specific as possible so that it's an idea that hasn't been shared a million times before. And then in the speaking points, also like to use really unique language to grab their interest. So instead of like, writing rewire your negative thinking, say to like the AI, here are these words. Can you please brainstorm like 10 very unique framework things that we could use?
Yes.
And then you create your unique name for that. And it just it grabs people's attention because we're habituated to seeing the same things. So suddenly it's like, oh, I've never seen those words before. Let me keep reading. And then you would explain, like, the process that you would take them through. But because you have a new name for it, it just seems different. So it's
Yeah,
packaged
agreed.
differently. And then by this point, hopefully they like your story, they like the speaking point, they think you're great. The next question on a host's mind is, who are you and can you pull this off? And so that's
Mm,
when it's say you need to have a very short but authoritative bio, and you want to link to and reference authority driving points. So those authority driving points would be just for example, yesterday I was talking to someone and he mentioned how he used to work in the military and was like an ex-officer. And so I was like, you should reference that. Like, even though it's not necessarily related to what you're doing now, it anchors you as someone who went and achieved that there. They kind of trust that you have like some kind of professional, interesting
yeah.
professional experience. And also, some people will relate to that and they'll be like, oh,
Yes.
like my dad was in the military and I really like the way he approached things and therefore I like you a little bit more. So it can be stuff like that. It could be publications you've been featured in. If you've ever done a TEDx talk, you would definitely want to reference that. If you were once having tea with someone famous, like you met Oprah for tea and she said something nice, like make that, that's like a great,
Oh,
interesting
totally.
credibility marker. So yeah, it's just thinking through like what makes me interesting, and it's not a resume. Like this is something you're going to fit in like
Hmm.
one line attached to your bio. So it's just like I'm quickly scanning, and I'm like, ooh, Forbes. Ooh, that famous person said something nice about you. And if you don't have those, that's okay. Like we build that over time.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are some interesting things that you can link there. And then include your links because at this point, if you've ticked all the boxes, the next thing the host wants to do is see who are you, and they want to look at your website. They want to see if you've ever been on podcasts before. If
Hmm.
you don't share those links, they're going to Google you and they might not land up in the places you want them to land up.
Totally.
So rather give them the links and they can click on those and see the things that you want them to see.
Yes. I hate when there's no links in pitch emails. I'm like, I
Yeah.
want to like check that person out. And this is another great reason I think for podcast guests to publish the episodes that they guest on as blogs on their website, because that's a super easy thing to share. As soon as someone goes to your website, you can see those. Um, Now, I loved that you brought up like frameworks and niching down your talking points, because I was going to ask you, should you share your 5-step framework, your this and that process or whatever method, or is that like naming something that they don't necessarily understand? Like I kind of see both sides.
Yeah, yeah. So I like to give like in the structure, and if you download the template, which is hostingwriters.com/template, you'll see that structure. But in the structure, I like to give like 3 or 4 words in bold, and then a colon, and then a brief explanation. So the
Okay.
words in bold are usually something you're not going to necessarily know, but it's going to intrigue you. So it'll be like, for
Right.
example, I'd say my story to frame framework, story to stage framework. Like and then after those colons, I'd be like, I'm going to share how I get exact the nitty-gritty details of how I book world-renowned entrepreneurs on top-rated podcasts. So the reader looking at it doesn't know what the story to stage framework is,
Right.
but then they keep reading and then they're like, oh, it's her teaching my listeners and me how to get booked on world-renowned podcasts. So that's where kind of like you have a bit of an
Yeah,
explanation, but in bold you put words that are intriguing and they want to read to know what the heck is that? I've never heard of that before.
totally. And I think when I see someone with a process, a method, a framework, I feel like they've got this proven system. I feel like it has so much more credibility that they've got their stuff together, they've got it made, like, you know what I mean? And they get results for clients. You just automatically have that first impression when you see those kinds of frameworks or processes or whatever.
Yeah, I completely agree. And anyone here who feels like they don't know how to do that, your AI is your friend. It can come up with
Yes.
some crazy stuff, steal someone else's framework. So, like, you could go to probably like Lindsay's website or someone you really admire, take what they've written in their framework, and then say to AI, this is an example, something really nice, and then share all the details of your business and say, brainstorm 50 framework
Yes.
ideas for me. And obviously, you're not taking their work, you're just
Yeah.
training the AI on something that works. And then a bunch of really interesting language will come up, and you will be able to create your proprietary system that you will put in your
Yes.
pictures in like a matter of minutes. And it just sounds so much more put together, as Lindsay said,
Agreed.
than just saying, I'll teach you how to
Yeah.
pitch.
And as a host, you feel like, okay, I know my audience is going to get value because they're going to learn this four-step blah blah blah. You can sort of picture the interview a little bit more easier and know the value that they're going to bring. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And that's your goal, right? Is to get into the
yeah,
host's mind. You want the host to be able to see exactly what, like, check every box that the host is thinking about. And like you said, Lindsay, you want to know that your listeners will learn something and there is a system that the speaker can bring take them
yeah,
through.
absolutely. Love it. So identify your position, get your story, find the right podcast, make a strong pitch. Is there anything I'm missing?
I say something else is opening with a specific like personalization. So before you even get
Mm,
into your story, I like to comment on something that they have shared. And a big mistake that people make when they try to personalize is that they'll say something very broad, like, I love your podcast. It's such an amazing podcast and it changed
hmm
my life. Or now with AI tools, they often reference an episode, but they'll just say, what an inspirational episode you had, and then insert whole episode title. So it's very clear it was like AI.
Yeah,
Um, it was game changing or something. So I would avoid, again, like broad statements. And I would comment about something specific. It could be about the podcast. So you could be mentioning a very specific thing that was said in the podcast episode. Like, I enjoyed how you and insert guest name discussed the dangers of Ozempic, especially blah blah thing.
totally.
You're not saying it's your favorite podcast in the world. You're showing the host that you listen to the
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah,
Or you could say, like, even something about their LinkedIn post, like, fascinating topic that you spoke about, like, insert thing, and then insert your observation. That just shows the host that you're not a complete rander. You
yeah.
actually have engaged with some of their stuff. And then the other thing is if you have some kind of connection to that host, I would then use that time instead of mentioning something, I would use it to actually mention that mutual connection. So that's
Yes,
like, for example, if I saw you, Lindsay, on Joe Casabona's podcast, I'd be like, I mean, I know him, but let's say like,
yeah,
I'd be like, I loved your episode with our mutual friend, Lindsay Phillips. And then I'd say something about the episode, especially when you guys spoke about blah, blah, blah. When you mention those mutual connections, it's just a bit warmer. They trust you a bit
totally.
more. You're not, a
Yeah,
complete random on the internet. You have a point of connection.
100%. Absolutely. Now, I do know that you have a course and you step people through all of these stages, if you will, to get podcast guests ready. I'd love if you could share it and then share the link to your free resource again as well.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So what I'm spoken about here is just in a lot more detail on the course, and the course is also made for someone who doesn't want to sit through hours and hours of video content. So every video lesson is 7 minutes at most. I think the longest one was like 8 minutes. And it was just like jam-packed value, and then it's an exercise. And so what I really want you to be doing is to be writing your pitches and
Mhm.
not spending hours learning about the process. You should be doing the process. And so
Love that.
write them, iterate them, send the follow-ups. And you can get that course, hustlingwriters.com/pitch your power. But if you just want to get a template and figure out the rest on your own by listening to this episode, you can also listen to other episodes I've been on talking about how to pitch podcasts. Then that's hustlingwriters.com/templates, and you can grab the free guide there for free and start pitching. Just start. It's a muscle. You get better the more you do it. You
Yeah.
learn, track your pitches in a spreadsheet
Yes.
so that you can see what's moving and what's not. Maybe some ideas are better than others. Maybe some types of podcasts seem to suit your messaging better. So definitely track it and dedicate time to doing it, because I think that's the other thing is that anything new is hard, and I'm not going to sit here and
Hmm.
tell you it's going to be easy because starting something new, we were just talking about starting a podcast is really intimidating and hard. So pitching podcasts is also intimidating and hard if it's your first time. And so doing something new just takes time, consistency, and it gets better once you just keep showing up.
Yeah. Agreed. And of course, if you want someone to completely take it off your plate and get strategic for you, hire Alice Draper and her team with your podcast booking agency. That to me would be the easiest way. Oh, so much. Yeah, the amount of research and the time involved with pitching to do it right. Uh, yeah, I couldn't imagine doing it myself, to be quite honest. But with your tips, gold, and you were so great on the summit. Thank you for joining me. I love spending time with you, and I just think your approach is has so much more depth than some of the other options that are out there. So yeah, I love it. I highly
Thank
recommend
you
you to
so
anyone.
much. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you. It's just been such a pleasure, and I also really, really appreciated your approach, especially in bringing the summit together. And yeah, such a pleasure to be here too.
And of course, I appreciate you being here and listening to this episode of Leverage Your Podcast Show. And I will see you in a couple of weeks. Take care, guys.